Good morning, everyone, and apologies that I can't be with you in person today. I was hoping to do so, but it just hasn't worked out. I'd like to start off with a scripture reading, just two verses from the book of Genesis, the very first two verses in the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And that is my subject for today. You may not realize it, but Earth has a water problem. Now, usually when you hear those words water problem, you think of things like drought or polluted rivers or something like that, but that's not what I'm talking about today. What I'm talking about is the fact that Earth has so much water, and the water is on the surface, where we can get at it. But where did it all come from? We just take rivers and lakes and oceans for granted. But if we lived on some of the other planets, in fact every other planet in the solar system, we would be able to look at Earth with envy. We might be on Mars, where everywhere is bone dry on the surface. We might be on Pluto, where there's water, but it's all frozen. It's ice. The problem is outlined in this issue of the New Scientist magazine. You can see down the bottom that one of the articles is Extremely Old Water. The article is by Natalie Starkey, who's a geochemist at the Open University, so she knows what she's talking about. And in the article she says we need to go back more than 4.6 billion years. That, of course, is assuming that the world is 4.5 billion years old. So we're going back before the planet Earth formed. The young Earth is shining, and encircling it is a maelstrom of gas and dust that will clump into the planets. Any water exists as ice in interstellar space. If any of that ice found itself in the inner part of the solar system, where the rocky planets like Earth will form, the heat and radiation from the sun, she means, split it into its constituent atoms of hydrogen and oxygen. And of course hydrogen and oxygen are gases. So any water that existed, any of this ice supposedly, it would have vanished, would have turned into gas long before it could be incorporated into planet Earth. This means, she concludes, that the material that formed Earth shouldn't have contained a speck of moisture, and I presume a speck is smaller than a drop. In other words, planet Earth, as originally formed, should not have contained any water at all, on the surface or anywhere else. Then, at some point, planet Earth was, according to the Boffins, struck by a huge object that they call Thea, and the resulting collision formed our moon. But it wasn't just, as I've seen some depictions, where this Thea bumped into the Earth and knocked a chunk off. Oh no. Let's imagine that somehow interstellar water did survive the tumultuous star-forming process to condense into oceans on Earth's surface. It would then have the small matter of the impact that formed the moon to contend with. The scientific consensus is that the impact was so epic that it vaporized our planet. Just turned the whole thing into gas and dust again. Some of that cloud of gas condensed into the moon, some of it collapsed under its own gravity to make Earth. I must admit I'm not clear as to why it should make two bodies and not all come together into one body, but there you go. And the conventional view is that water could not have survived this. So again, water would have been reduced to gas. Any water that was around would have been reduced to gas. It was gas in the beginning, and so the planet couldn't have had any water, but if it did have any water, it was turned into gas again and couldn't have provided any water on the surface of the Earth. All right. Well, this is Natalie Starkey is not saying anything new. This has been known for a long time. Now, to try and explain the fact that we have so much water, scientists have come up with the idea that Earth's water was delivered by comets and other icy objects colliding with Earth. There'd have to be an awful lot of them, but if Earth is 4.5 billion years old, well, I suppose that gives you enough time for a good many comets to hit the Earth. There's just one problem. The only comet we have visited turned out to have the wrong type of water. A strong blow to the idea that cosmic missiles delivered our water came from the Rosetta probe, which visited comet 67P Churyumov-Gerasimenko in 2014, and discovered that it had the wrong type of water, the wrong isotope of water. And Natalie goes on to say that for decades astronomers have been hunting for a comet or asteroid that contains the right type of water, together with the right mix of other elements we know were delivered in the late Veneer, that is, in a late period of Earth's history. So far, nothing fits. Not a single one. That brings us to an impasse. Our story so far says that water shouldn't have been present when Earth formed, it shouldn't have survived the moon-forming impact, and it seems our water can't have been delivered by any comet or asteroid we know of. So, that is the water problem. We shouldn't have a single speck of water, but we do. Our planet is covered by water, and all life depends upon water. Without water, we would not have life. So, when the impossible, when you've exhausted all the possibilities, Natalie comes up with a crazy suggestion of her own. This brings us to the surprising conclusion that our planet's water isn't just older than the moon, it must have come from interstellar space, which means it's older than the sun itself. There's just one problem. Interstellar space has been extensively studied with telescopes and infrared and all the rest of it, and although we've found lots of dust clouds, so far as I know, we haven't found any water clouds. So where did all this water come from? But don't let an inconvenient fact or two spoil an evolutionist's daydreams. It's hard to fathom how it survived entry into the solar system. But once you have eliminated the impossible, it forces you to that conclusion. This, of course, is a reference to Sherlock Holmes, the fictional detective, who said once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So Natalie suggests that there was a brief moment of time when the sun wasn't too hot and all this water just flowed in and took advantage of Earth. Now, I don't know whether her picture is that it just zoomed in on our planet, in which case I would suggest that it arrived on Earth very shortly after a certain man had finished building a big wooden boat and stocking it with two of every kind of animal. And I could tell you that the rain continued to fall for 40 days and 40 nights. Or did it come in sort of more generally encompassing the whole of the solar system? But if that was so, where's all the water on Mars? If it hit all the planets equally, where's the water on Mars? Well, actually, the scientists say that there are evidences for water, that there was once water on Mars, and there may even be still substantial quantities of water frozen and buried beneath the surface, and these channels are supposed to be proof of that. But all the surface water is gone. It's been vaporized by meteor impacts, it's been sublimated by solar radiation, that means evaporated, turned into gas again, and evaporated by the low atmospheric pressure on Mars. But two of those things also apply to Earth, the solar radiation and the meteor impacts. So why have we held on to our water when Mars hasn't? Well, one reason that has been given is that we just happen, we're lucky, we have a large moon which keeps our planet stable. Mars doesn't have a moon, and so it wobbles as much as 45 degrees. That's an enormous wobble, and it means that the poles get heated up from the sun and they get radiation from the sun, whereas our poles generally remain cold. But, when you're piling up all these coincidences, the water arriving just on our planet, the planet having a big moon, the water arriving just when the sun was not too hot and not too cold. All these coincidences. Isn't it easier to say that God made it so? And remember, once you have eliminated the impossible, the unthinkable becomes credible. Mind you, water is a very interesting substance. Have you ever wondered why concrete roads are laid in blocks so that you keep going thud, thud, thud as you drive along? Why isn't it one smooth concrete surface all the way from London to Edinburgh? Well, the reason is something called thermal expansion. When things get hot, they expand. When things get cold, they contract. And if engineers don't make allowances for this, you can end up with disastrous situations like these railway lines, which were put too close together or maybe welded together without proper adjustments for thermal expansion. And when the sun got hot, you can see what happened. Well, there's one exception to this rule: water. Unlike everything else, water expands when it freezes. That's why you have ice floating, because the water that turned into ice, has expanded, not shrunk, has expanded, and therefore it's less dense than water, and so it floats on water. Now, just think about what that means. Life would be impossible if it were not for this very convenient fact. Consider a lake, all very nice in summer, beautiful warm water you can go swimming in, and then along comes winter, and the surface of the lake freezes. But in the world as we have it today, where ice expands, the ice floats on top of the water, remains on top of the water, and so when the sun comes back, it can get at the ice and melt it, and we're back to the nice warm lake again. If ice sank to the bottom, then so much ice would form, the summer would come along, and the sun would not be able to melt it. Next winter, you'd have even more ice, and more ice with each succeeding winter, until finally in the summer you were only able to have a thin layer of freezing cold water on top. It would not be the sort of environment in which life could exist, let alone evolve. So this peculiarity of water is what makes life possible on our planet. Mind you, water is about more than just drinking. Earth's oceans hide a secret, a process which would not have been possible without water. Now, have a look at this map. You can see how running down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean there is a ridge. It's called the Midatlantic Ridge. And what it is a place where two plates are moving apart, the European plate and the American plate. In fact, you can actually see this if you go to Iceland in the Thingvellir National Park. You can see the split between the North American and the European plates. In fact, in one place it's wide enough that people can walk through. It's one of the tourist sites of Iceland. If ever I go to Iceland, that's one of the places I want to see. Mind you, fortunately for these people, the plates don't appear to be moving very fast. Here's someone who's down underwater swimming between the plates. And I get the feeling that this chap is trying to speed up the process by pushing the plates apart with his hands. Well, as the plates move apart, they press on the land on either side, on the European continent and on the American continent. As these plates move apart, this is what you get. You either have uplift or subduction. Let's look at that again. Uplift is when a plate presses against another and forces it up into a mountain range. Subduction is when a plate is forced down into the interior of the Earth. Let's look at it again. Uplift, mountain forming. Subduction, down into the interior of the Earth where it gets melted. Okay, so according to the theory, you have the mid-Atlantic ridge where the lava is coming up into the middle and pressing the two plates apart. And in this case, both America and Europe or Africa are actually moving as well. But in the Pacific ridge, you have the ocean crust going down underneath the American and the Asian plates. Now, we know that these plates are moving because the clearest illustration of them is in the San Andreas Fault in California, where two plates are sliding past each other. And you can see that very clearly here. Here's another illustration. You've got a stream coming in from the right. Originally it just flowed on down to the left, but as the plate has moved northwards, the stream has been bent northwards. And just to give you another illustration, here in a road cutting, you have the North American plate bumping into the Pacific plate. Now, the direction of movement is this way, so it's that lower bit which is moving right to left and forcing the other into the contortions and folds that you see there. This process of plate movements is supposed to have given us mountain ranges such as the Alps and the Andes. And you can see here how Italy is being forced up into the underneath of Europe and is creating the mountain ranges of the Alps. All this is happening very slowly. It's estimated that America and Europe are moving apart about as fast as a fingernail grows. And in case you don't know how long that is, here's a woman who has been growing her fingernails for 33 years. Looks horrible in my opinion, but there you go. That means that in the 50 years I've been living in Britain, America is now 54 inches further away, 4 feet 6 inches. Yeah, that's still not far enough for my liking, but that's another story. Now, the geologists tell us that originally all the continents were joined together in one supercontinent, which they call Pangea. If the statement, "there shall be no more sea," applied in Eden, then we have to assume that the splitting of the continents happened after sin, and probably happened at the time of the flood. It's interesting that in the record of the generations after the flood, there is mention of a young man who was called Peleg because in his time the earth was divided. Now, we're not exactly sure what it means by the earth was divided. Some have suggested it's a reference to the nations being divided by language as at the Tower of Babel, but it's possible that it's a reference to the earth, the physical earth actually splitting. Perhaps the Great Rift Valley opening up or something like that. Well, if we date the Atlantic Ocean to the time since the fall, or the time since the flood, then we've got 3,200 miles, that's how far it is from Britain to New York, in approximately 6,000 years. That means that the plates must have moved on average half a mile per year. And the boffins will tell you that is simply not possible because such rapid movement would generate enormous heat. And, the whole thing would melt. It just would not be possible. They are faced with another problem, though. As plates move, one rides up above the other, forcing it down into the mantle where it is dissolved by heat. But that implies an enormous downward force on the plate coming in from the left. What force, they ask in New Scientist, can crack through a tectonic plate at least 70 kilometers thick? That's, getting on for 50 miles thick. And 1,000 kilometers long, 800 miles, and then bend it downwards so that it can slide into the mantle. According to simple calculations, forces from plates pushing on each other wouldn't do it. So you've got these two plates pushing against each other, and there is just not enough force to drive one under the other. So the scientists came up with an alternative suggestion, that is, the rivers are bringing down sediments and silt, and it's all piling up on this other plate, and eventually the weight of the sediment pushes it down, and that starts it going. But again, the weight of sediments dumped by rivers at the edge of continents are far too weak, far too light to crack a plate. Oh dear. Well, this article on New Scientist tells us that the scientists have been doing experiments on a rock called olivine that makes up 50% of the upper mantle, that is 50% of the continental crusts. They found that at the temperatures and pressures typical 40 kilometers underground, wet olivine deforms 10 times as fast as dry olivine. And most importantly, the olivine doesn't need to be very wet. Just add 20 parts per million of water, and the mineral oozes easily. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Just a tiny little bit of water, and this olivine oozes 10 times faster than the dry stuff does. But even that couldn't account for it. However, this chappie, John Baumgartner, my main interest is in modelling catastrophic plate tectonics. Laboratory experiments show that silicate materials can weaken by a factor of 1 billion under relatively modest stress changes. 1 billion becomes 1 billion times weaker. Well, that removes all your worries about tectonic plates moving faster. As a slab of rock descends into the mantle, there's deformation in the zone between the slab and the surrounding mantle, and as the stress increases, the material becomes even weaker, allowing the slab to fall more rapidly, and this increases the stress, so you have positive feedback. The more you push on it, the weaker it becomes, and the more easily it deforms. This allows plate motions that are generally understood to require hundreds of millions of years to unfold to occur in a few weeks. Wow, think of that. America and Europe getting 3,000 miles apart in just a few weeks. If only that was still going on, eh? Well, the interesting thing is, it isn't still going on. Do you remember the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004? It was caused by the Burmese plate riding up over the Indian Ocean plate. And they sent down a submersible with a camera, and this is a photograph of the two plates bumping against each other. And the Indian plate cracked. It didn't bend, it didn't deform, it cracked. And one side popped up 11 feet, causing the world's ocean to rise by 0.01 of a millimeter. I don't know who was down there measuring it. But why didn't the plate bend, as geological theory claims it should have? Well, I think the answer is that after the flood, the chemical processes that turned sand and silt and what have you into rock turned all these rocks hard, so that the factor of 1 billion no longer applied. All these rocks are hard. They're less pliable. They crack. They do not bend. Now, you look at the great Lulworth Crumple down in the Lulworth Cove in Dorset. You look at the way those rocks are bent and twisted. There is no way that modern rocks could go like that. They would crack. They'd break. They must have been softer when the forces that were applied to make these bends were functioning. And, you know, really, geologists, evolutionists are very dishonest. Here's one chap who is trying to persuade children about all the long ages and how it all works this way, and he suggests that you take plasticine, different coloured plasticine, several layers of it, and then push it sideways with your hands and see it fold. And of course you would. But what he glosses over is the fact that plasticine is soft. Remember when you were playing with it? If it ever got hard, you threw it out. He doesn't recommend that you first bake the plasticine to make it hard, as real rocks are, and then try squashing it, because he knows that if you did, if you were able to apply sufficient force, the plasticine would shatter. It would not bend and fold. That is, in my books, dishonest. Well, some years ago, I think it was back in the 50s, this book, The Genesis Flood, was an attempt to provide a scientific basis for the flood. Some of their suggestions were almost certainly wrong. You know, we have more knowledge these days. But it was a serious and a credible piece of work. And the thing I want to point out is that they dealt with the question of the Genesis rocks. And they put forward the suggestion that the primordial rocks, or the creation rocks, are the Precambrian, because, they said, those are the rocks that have no fossils. So when God created the earth, the rocks didn't have any buried animals in them. That's the Precambrian, because after the Precambrian you have the Cambrian, and then you have a lot of life. Well, a few years ago, somebody came up with the discovery that he'd found fossils in Precambrian rocks, which was a problem, and a problem for the Genesis flood, because it meant that there are no creation rocks. But I'm glad to say it was also a problem for evolutionists, as this issue of New Scientist makes plain. Crystals that look just like fossilized bacteria have been grown in the lab, disproving the idea that such structures are too complex to form in the absence of life. The conclusion has serious repercussions for the debate about the emergence of life on Earth. Controversy has dogged the interpretation of microscopic worm-like structures embedded in Australian rocks ever since their discovery in the 1980s. William Schopf, now at the University of California, says that they are fossilized bacteria. He claims to have identified 11 different species, including some that photosynthesize. But the rocks they are embedded in are 3.5 billion years old. If the structures are bacteria, they would be the oldest signs of life yet discovered, but many scientists doubt that such complex life forms could exist so early in Earth's history. So if these things are not bacteria, but are just crystals, then it may well be that Whitcomb and Morris were right after all, and the Precambrian are indeed the original rocks of creation. But note that according to Wikipedia, the Precambrian accounts for 88% of Earth's history of geologic time. And then, after this 88% of time had gone on, came the Cambrian Explosion, or also known as the Cambrian radiation. It was a relatively short evolutionary event beginning about 542 million years ago in the Cambrian period, during which most major animal phyla appeared. In other words, in this short period of time, virtually all the animals that we have today, as many of them as we have today, suddenly appeared. Prior to the Cambrian explosion, most organisms were simple, composed of individual cells, occasionally organized into colonies. Over the following 70 to 80 million years, the rate of diversification accelerated by an order of magnitude, and the diversity of life began to resemble that of today. Now, of course, that's basically figuring what the Bible says. First, there was a long period when there was no life, and God hadn't created or hadn't formed the earth. Then there was a period when there was life but no death, and then it was followed by the rapid deposition of fossils of every kind. The Cambrian explosion has generated extensive scientific debate. In 1859, Charles Darwin discussed it as one of the main objections that could be made against the theory of evolution by natural selection, because he recognized that, suddenly all these creatures appear, but far too quickly for evolution to have taken place. It's interesting that when he first set out on his famous voyage in the Beagle, he was given the first volume of a book by this man, the Scottish geologist Charles Lyle, whose book, The Principles of Geology, attempted to show that the Earth was enormously old, and that the geologic formations we see today were produced by the same processes that we see today at the same rates that we see today. This is called Uniformitarianism. Wikipedia again. Lyle is best known as the author of Principles of Geology, which presented to a wide public audience the idea that the Earth was shaped by the same natural processes still in operation today, operating at similar intensities. The philosopher William Whewell termed this gradualistic view uniformitarianism. Lyle favoured an indefinitely long age for the Earth, despite evidence suggesting an old but finite age. He was a close friend of Charles Darwin and contributed significantly to Darwin's thinking on the processes involved in evolution. Darwin needed long periods of time for evolution to work. Lyle gave him those long periods of time. And yet, if only he'd thought really, he would have known that his theory was bunkum. One of the evidences that he puts forward in his book, and he includes a woodcut to illustrate it, are these pillars at Pozzuoli in Italy. And you can see that there is an area of something strange going on there. The pillars are smooth below, the pillars are smooth above, but you have this area of roughness. Now, we know when these pillars were built. They form part of the Roman Forum, so we know when they were built. And at some point, they sank below the sea. That's what Lyle says. That's what the evidence shows, because this roughness is caused by lithophagia mollusks, that is, mollusks that eat rock. And then the pillars emerged again. But it's an argument not for Lyle, but against him, because the mollusks haven't eaten all the way up. There's a sudden drop, then a sudden rise, leaving a band of untouched marble at the bottom of the pillars. You can see it here. You've got here where the mollusks haven't eaten. You've got up here where the mollusks haven't eaten. And in between, you have this area where the mollusks have. So clearly, the pillars must have sunk down below the sea rapidly before the mollusks could get at the lower portion. In recent years, geologists have begun to question the laws of uniformitarianism Lyle laid out. There is now clear evidence of catastrophic change caused by volcanic eruptions, large earthquakes, asteroid impacts, and so on. Even if catastrophes are rare, their magnitude may affect geology more than has been appreciated under Lyle's version of uniformitarianism. Right? So, uniformitarianism cannot explain Earth's water, the mystery with which we started this presentation. Where did it all come from? How come there is so much of it? Uniformitarianism is not needed to explain Earth movements. Catastrophes do that very nicely. Uniformitarianism is contradicted by the Cambrian Explosion, where life suddenly appears and multiplies. Uniformitarianism is disproved by the evidences for catastrophes, so many of them that we can't count them all. But if there are no long geologic periods, then there's no biologic evolution, because there isn't time for it. That's the problem Darwin faced. That is why he was so grateful to Lyle for his theories. You know, it reminds me of what St. Peter said. First of all, you must understand that in the last days scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. But they deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens existed, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. Original water. Water created by God and put in place by God. Remember what Natalie Starkey says. It's hard to fathom how water survived entry into the solar system. But once you have eliminated the impossible, it forces you to the conclusion. What conclusion? I would say the conclusion that the Bible has the story right, and Darwin and Lyle and Natalie Starkey have it wrong. Let's bow our heads. And now may the grace of God, the love of Jesus, and the close friendship of the Holy Spirit be with us all till he come. Amen.